Hi, I'm Beth Haller. I'm professor of mass communication at Towson University in Maryland. I also teach disability studies there and at several other campuses. I teach at City University of New York in their disability studies program. I teach at York University in Toronto in their disability studies program. I teach at University of Texas Arlington in their disability studies minor. I've been doing research since the early 90s about media representations of people with disabilities. So I have a kind of a unique relationship to the ADA because I did my dissertation on how the news media covered it. So before I went to Temple University in Philadelphia to get my PhD, I was at University of Maryland, College Park, getting my master's. And I started that in 1989. And there's a reason for all these numbers, these dates. And in 1988 is when the Deaf President Now movement happened at Gallaudet University in DC. And I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew about what was happening because I was a journalist before I became an academic. And so when I started at College Park in 1989, I ended up doing an article for a class about a deaf student at Gallaudet. And I got very interested in the deaf community, that there's a huge deaf community in the DC area. Ended up doing my master's thesis on how the deaf community was represented before, during, and after Deaf President Now in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And that was a jumping off point because when I left College Park, it was 1991. And so the ADA had just been passed. And when I got to Temple to start working on my PhD, I knew that I wanted to still work in the area of disability. And we just had this major disability rights law passed. And so I remember it more as a focus of my research because I don't necessarily remember seeing the actual coverage on the day it happened in 1990. But I do remember looking at all the coverage because that was the subject of my dissertation. And so it was really interesting to look at it as an academic and to kind of watch it happen and then not happen as it moved into the future. So my dissertation looked at kind of how the mainstream news media, all the big news magazines and the major newspapers back then. And so I finished my dissertation in 94, graduated in 95. So it was very early days of the ADA, and so it wasn't really being implemented yet. It was, because I gave several years for people to get into compliance. But, as the years have passed, it's been very interesting to watch how things weren't happening. And I think what we all thought was going to happen was Congress passes this major disability rights law, and then people will follow it because it's now federal law not to discriminate based on disability. But that isn't what happened. And from a media standpoint, that really kind of hurt the ADA because, and I've even had this conversation with disability studies scholars and disability rights activists because they, I think, thought that same way, that it's now law and everything will be fine. And there was such a history of being covered in the media so badly that the activists thought they could get this passed and then everything will be fine, and they didn't need the media for anything. And so I come onto the scene, I start going to Society for Disability Studies meetings in the early 90s and started presenting my research. And even the disability community in those first early years, right after the ADA, didn't understand why the media was important. Because I remember presenting at a conference and at a disability studies conference, and people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, that's really nice that you do work on media. But, we have bigger things we need to be dealing with, getting people jobs, getting people a proper education, getting people out of nursing homes." My response to everybody was, how do you think you're going to do that if you're not getting out information into public opinion? So if you're not able to change public opinion, how can you get these things accomplished? And how do you get public opinion changed? You get a proper narrative going in the media. And now there's actual disability studies research and disability activists who talked about this in the early 2000s about they took the wrong tactic after the ADA was passed and decided that, you know, it was passed, it would get enforced, yay, we can move on. But unfortunately, the business kind of narrative came into the mix, and they controlled the message that was in the media. And so for quite a number of years after the ADA was passed, it wasn't being enforced because there was this narrative in the news media that it was an unfunded mandate, and well, we never saw a person with a disability in our store. Why do we have to do all this stuff? Well, of course, the reason they didn't see a person with was a wheelchair user in their stores because it wasn't accessible, or nobody came to their website because it was inaccessible. But they didn't get that, and a lot of the journalists didn't know. People in the disability community, and the disability community was very wary of the news media because they've done such a bad job. But any news coverage, in my opinion, is better than no news coverage usually. And so the business community really took over the narrative and had this really kind of negative perception of the ADA that was funneling into the media. And then people just didn't know about it because it wasn't getting covered that much. There was a national poll done, I believe in like 1995, of Americans about what they knew about the ADA and other disability rights issues. Only 18% of Americans in 1995 had even heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think I'm remembering the stats right. And so to me, that is the fault of not engaging with media to do stories about that. And I know it's very difficult. Even today, it's very difficult to get the media to do a more complex policy, legal, government related story about disability, and not one of those kind of inspiration kind of narrative stories. But it's still worth fighting to try to get those stories into the media. And the other kind of like data point I would say about what I always tell my students when we're talking about the ADA is the ADA's enforcement depends on who's in the White House. So we had quite a number of Republican presidents who did not care about the ADA being enforced for like 8 years. So that's why it really only got more enforced once Barack Obama became president. So there's a lot of external factors that meant that the ADA was not going to be changing things as radically as we would have hoped when we were thinking back in 1990. The ADA has had impact in more recent years, like I said, since President Obama came into office, and it was just getting enforced. I use a lot of these kind of examples in my class of news stories about, you know, the ADA finally being implemented. And a couple that I use, one is about a little city in Pennsylvania. The headlines of a lot of ADA stories still are kind of, I say they have this like blaming tone, like, you know, things are expensive because of the ADA, things are closing because of the ADA. And I always tell my students that narrative should be flipped. The story really is, why didn't this town in Pennsylvania comply with the ADA for, you know, however many years, 20 years. And so that to me is the real story. This one headline was about, you know, this town, I believe it was Logansport, Pennsylvania. You know, the headline was, you know, they must pay $8 million for some kind of ADA compliance that they were finally going to do, I think in like 2008 or something. And I'm like, okay, that $8 million would have been a lot less if they just been compliant back in 1992 when they were supposed to be compliant. But they're still blaming the ADA. But now I think people, the general public now knows a lot more. And I actually chalk a lot up to social media, because now people are getting like not a mediated story through the news media and some journalist or some newscaster. They're actually on social media with people with disabilities and see what their life is like. And I know in the last couple of years when there was kind of an assault on the ADA and people were in Congress were thinking about, and the president was thinking about figuring out a way to knock it out. I saw lots allies on social media because they were finally aware that there was a disability rights law, and they said it should stay, it should not be repealed. And so I think the media have a lot of power, and now that we have this very personal media of social media, people get to know actual people with disabilities in their community, and they see the benefits of having things in Braille, or having captioning, or having wheelchair ramps, or just thinking about asking somebody before you barrel ahead and create something that may be inaccessible. So I think the general public is a lot more aware than they were in 1995, when only 18% of people had even heard of the ADA. And even if they haven't heard of ADA, they're in favor of disability rights. And I think that's one thing that came out of that survey, even back in 1995, is that they might have heard of the ADA, but if you pose to Americans the concepts of disability rights, then they agree with that. They don't think people should be discriminated against just because they need a ramp to get into a building, or need a sign language interpreter to apply for a job. So I think there's a better feeling among the American public in terms of understanding disability rights and making sure that, you know, everybody has equal access. And also I think people now understand that people with disabilities are them, are their friends, are their family members. And so a lot of the kind of like hidden stuff that was happening before the ADA, where people with disabilities were being hidden in their families or nobody talked about it. I even noticed that when I started teaching at Temple when I was a grad student, that the younger generation, because a lot of them had been grown up in inclusive education, there was no shame. They were proud to talk about their own disability, their parents' disability, their siblings' disability. You know, I still remember students, we had a discussion, actually one of my journalism classes, and one student, she was talking about that her mother was fluent in sign language because both of her grandparents were deaf, and so her mother's first language was sign language, even though she was hearing. Another kid was like, you know, my brother has Down syndrome, and he said it with pride. So I think kind of the cultural change that the ADA brought is really powerful too, because that is what gets you to the place, if you're a business person, that, oh, okay, well, maybe I should be more open to hiring somebody with Down syndrome to work at my grocery store or whatever. So I think having that kind of cultural change where people are now including the disability community as part of the American citizenry, then that is a very powerful thing, I think, that the ADA did. Yeah, if the ADA stays around, I think that's a really good part of our future, because it's a really good law. It was written really well, and it just needs to be enforced at all times. And I think, you know, we learned about how it could be enforced in those 8 years that President Obama was in office. And I think we can continue to learn that. And the Justice Department and Department of Ed and all the other federal agencies that enforce it, I think the community knows how to reach them and tell them to enforce things. And people, I think, are even getting a little bit better. Even the business community understands now that people with disabilities are a major part of our consumer culture. And now, you know, with the pandemic and, you know, everybody kind of working online, you know, people with disabilities can be the leaders. They're the ones that have been doing the workaround to try to make a living when they've not been able to go to an inaccessible building. So I think the future is bright if we will listen to disabled people about what the world needs to basically embrace everyone and accommodate everyone. And it'll be a better future for everyone, because, you know, we talk about the kind of hidden benefits of access for everyone. So, you know, think about all the people that use curb cuts for their wheelie luggage, and all the UPS guys that use curb cuts for rolling their hand carts, and, you know, all the bars that use closed captioning because they're loud. You know, so everybody gets benefits from disability related access. And I think it can only get better if we will learn to trust that the disability community can lead us, because they're the ones that are most innovative and kind of entrepreneurial about making sure that they can move forward in the most, you know, access friendly ways. So I think there should be a lot more listening to people with disabilities in the future, and because they've already worked out the problems that we're now dealing with in a pandemic. And, you know, I think they can help us build a future that's better for everyone, whether you have a disability or not. So what steps can we take right now? I think just being, if you're not a person with a disability, being a good ally. If you're a family member, being helping to make sure that the person in your family with a disability is empowered to be independent, and, you know, giving them all the support they need. If you're a person with a disability, making sure that the world is accommodating to you. And everybody needs to, you know, focus on the kind of making the world completely accessible. Like, you know, a lot of people live in houses that cannot be made accessible, and a lot of things are grandfathered into the ADA because they were, you know, built long before the ADA existed. But there's other locations, there's online, there's video chatting, there's all kinds of workarounds that I think we can all embrace. And we got to quit whining about this stuff because, you know, I mean, I'm talking to you in the middle of a pandemic, but I hear so many people complaining about things that I'm like, you know, this is all good. If we can all still be connected, it's fine. And things are going to change. We need to learn to adapt. People with disabilities can teach us how to adapt. And they have a major disability rights organization called ADAPT as well. And so, I mean, I think that's the key for all of us, is to start learning to roll with it, learning to adapt, and make sure that we're bringing everyone along into this new world that we're going to have to fashion post-pandemic, and that it's accessible to everyone, that we're all equal, that we're making sure that supports and what people need are in place, and then we can be a better community. It's kind of a weird time to be talking about all this. I mean, I know it's the ADA 30th anniversary, and I'm very glad that it is here and still exists, but I really feel like we can use the model of the ADA from 30 years ago as we move forward. And since we're going to have to restructure so much of our world, why not do it accessibly this time? And I think the ADA can still give us guidance, even though it's 30 years old. I mean, I think it was built to lead us into the future, just like a lot of our founding documents were. And I think if we look at the spirit of everything that's been passed in the good way of giving people rights in this country, and we follow them, we will fashion the future of a place that is hopefully very accessible, and make sure that everybody has equal access to our world.